Welcome back. If you thought our last session was deep, prepare yourself, because today we are embarking on the full, unabridged deep dive exploration of one of the most powerful, and criminally misunderstood, concepts in human interaction, anchoring bias. This isn't just theory, this is the blueprint for controlling conversations and, frankly, controlling outcomes. We're talking about setting the initial price point so high or low that your opponent's counteroffer immediately registers to them as a bargain. It sounds simple, but mastering it requires surgical precision. At its core, anchoring bias is a cognitive shortcut. It's a psychological phenomenon where our brains rely too heavily on the very first piece of information presented, the anchor, when making all subsequent judgments or estimations. Our minds are lazy, they prefer to use established reference points rather than performing complex calculations from scratch. Think of it this way, the first number mentioned, no matter how arbitrary or wildly inflated, immediately becomes the mental cage for all future discussions. It sets the parameters of perceived value. If I anchor you to $10,000, when you counter with $7,000, your brain doesn't process it as a significant drop, it processes it as a good deal from $10,000. The genius here isn't in the number itself, it's in the perception of that number. We aren't negotiating value, we are negotiating against an anchor. Understanding this bias means understanding that you are not selling a product or service, you are managing expectations. Most people approach negotiations defensively. They wait for the other side to make the first move, hoping their opponent will set a favorable anchor. This is amateur hour. The moment you allow someone else to establish that initial reference point, you have ceded control of the entire conversation. Our goal is to become the architect of the initial narrative. You must be prepared to deploy an anchor, a number, a date, a scope, that forces your opponent into a reactive position, making their subsequent counteroffers seem reasonable by comparison. Let's look at pricing. If you are selling a premium service, never start by listing your base rate. Instead, anchor high by mentioning an all-inclusive package or a premium tier that includes features you know the client doesn't need, but which makes your actual desired price seem like a massive discount. This is the art of strategic over-indexing. You are deliberately inflating the perceived scope so that when you pull back to your actual, desired price point, they feel like they have won a substantial victory. Conversely, if you are negotiating for salary or resources and fear being anchored too high, you can use a low anchor strategically. You set a minimum expectation that is slightly below your true value, allowing them to feel they have saved money while still agreeing to terms that benefit you. This requires emotional detachment. You must treat the numbers not as personal statements of worth, but as purely mathematical variables in a complex equation that you are solving for maximum advantage. The biggest mistake novices make is reacting to the anchor. They get defensive or try to immediately disprove it. Do not engage in that emotional tug-of-war. Instead, acknowledge the number calmly and pivot back to your pre-planned narrative. Your response must be one of measured curiosity. That's an interesting starting point. To ensure we are aligned on the full scope, let me walk you through how our methodology addresses X and Y. You redirect the focus from the number to the process. This brings us to the actionable hack, prescripting 3 counter anchors. Before any meeting, salary review, client pitch, investment discussion, you must know your opening moves. These 3 anchors should cover different scenarios: the aggressive high anchor, for maximum perceived value, the moderate anchoring point, the ideal compromise zone, and the lowball counter anchor, if they try to corner you. The first anchor is your shield. It's designed not necessarily to be true, but to be believable and dramatically different enough from the final outcome that it shifts their entire frame of reference. When you deploy your counter anchors, remember to justify them with scope creep. Don't just say, it should be $X, say, given the necessary integration of our 3 departments and the required quarterly reporting structure, we are looking at a starting point around $X. The more detailed your justification for the anchor, the less likely they are to dismiss it as arbitrary. You build credibility into the number itself. Consider the psychological weight of effort. If you make your initial anchor sound like it required immense effort or specialized resources to calculate, they will treat that number with more respect, regardless of its actual value. This is about controlling the narrative flow. You are not merely responding to questions, you are guiding them toward conclusions that favor your preset anchors. If they try to pull you off course by focusing on minor details or tangential concerns, gently but firmly redirect them back to the core value proposition that supports your initial anchor. For example, while those operational details are important, let's circle back to the initial scope we discussed, the full implementation across 3 continents. That scale is what dictates our starting valuation. This technique forces them to reconcile their minor concerns against the massive scope you have established, making their counteroffers seem disproportionately small. It's not just about money. Anchoring bias applies to timeframes, risk assessment, and even perceived difficulty. If you anchor the timeline as a full 18-month transformation, any counteroffer of 6 months sounds rushed or inadequate. When establishing time anchors, use specific, non-rounded numbers. Instead of a few weeks, say approximately 28 to 35 business days. Specificity lends an air of researched authority that is difficult to challenge. Remember, the goal is not necessarily to win the highest number. The goal is to establish a high reference point that makes your desired outcome feel like the most rational, sensible compromise. Practice this in low-stakes environments first. Negotiate for things that don't cost you much, a better seat at a restaurant, a discount on a mundane purchase. This builds the muscle memory required for high-stakes scenarios. The confidence you project when anchoring must be absolute. You cannot sound like you are guessing, you must sound like you have run complex, proprietary models that arrived at this specific number. If they challenge your anchor, do not immediately defend it with data. Instead, ask clarifying questions that force them to define the parameters you have set. When you say X, are you factoring in Y complexity? This subtle shift of responsibility, making them define the scope against your anchor, is where you win. You make them do the mental heavy lifting for you. Mastering anchoring bias is less about deception and more about superior preparation. It's about controlling the initial conditions of any high-stakes discussion. Approach every conversation, whether it's with an investor or a friend discussing plans, as a negotiation. Identify the potential anchors they might use, and preemptively build your counter-anchors. The true masters don't just set an anchor, they create an entire ecosystem of anchors, a web of interconnected data points that make their final number seem inevitable, logical, and therefore, correct. Never let the conversation drift into a vacuum where no numbers are being discussed. Always keep the financial or scope metrics visible in your mind's eye, ready to deploy an anchor. If you feel yourself losing control of the conversation, immediately pivot back to your strongest prescripted anchor. It's like hitting the reset button on their cognitive bias. Remember that confidence is not just about what you say, it's about how little you seem to care if they challenge it. Your conviction must be unshakable. By understanding the mechanics of anchoring bias, you move from being a participant in negotiations to becoming the primary architect of them. You are no longer reacting, you are designing. Go forth, not just to negotiate, but to anchor. Set the stage high, set it low, set it perfectly, and watch how easily your desired outcome becomes their perceived reality. This deep dive is complete. The tools are yours. Now go out there and make sure that first number you drop into the ring is one they can't afford to ignore.